Welcome to 3 Point Cyber, a podcast about cybersecurity topics and events for the layperson. The ideas, opinions, and discussions of this podcast are those of the host, co-host, and guest and do not necessarily represent the views of their respective employers or affiliates. Recording and propagation of this podcast is highly encouraged as long as an acknowledgement is given to the ownership. Music and graphics used in the podcast and promotional materials cannot be used in other events not tied to the podcast without the express written consent from Alpha Omega Advisors. We're here now for episode number 12. And we are excited about our guest today. We've got someone here that I've been looking forward to having on for quite some time, and we've not been able to get together for other unforeseen reasons, or he's been busy, or something else has come up on my end, and we've just not been able to get going. But it's going to be a good podcast, so I'm looking forward to it. Andrew, how you doing over there?
Yeah, doing great, thanks. Actually, my girlfriend and I got to watch the first episode of the second season of Only Murders in the Building, so we're pretty excited about that. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's about a basically murder podcast.
Haven't heard that one.
No, really? Okay. Uh-oh. Well, Steve Martin Short are in it.
Well, you can't go wrong then. Can't go wrong.
Exactly. But she did mention that she thought that our next podcast should be Cyber Murders.
Cyber
so
Murders. Well, we'd have to think about that one. I'm not sure how we would carry that one through.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but I had to tell her we'd mull it over.
Always up for ideas, right? You never know when that next idea is going to be the big one.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and get into the podcast here, and I'm going to introduce and kind of give you some background on our guest today. Perry Carpenter is our guest, and he is the author of 2 books, Transformational Security Awareness, What Neuroscientists, Storytellers, and Marketers Can Teach Us About Driving Secure Behaviors, and his latest book, The Security Culture Playbook, an executive guide to reducing risk and developing your human defense layer. I picked up that book shortly after he posted that it was published, and I have thoroughly enjoyed that book. There's great insights in it, and it's amazing. As I was reading through it, I'm thinking, wow, I had those same ideas, and I'm a little envious that he got it down on paper before I did. So we'll get into some of those really good topics. Perry is also the creator and host of the 8th Layer Insights podcast, another great podcast. If you're into these things, you need to pick that one up and start listening to that one. We'll talk a little bit about that one as we get him on here in a little while as well. He currently serves as the Chief Evangelist and Strategy Officer for KnowBe4. KnowBe4 Company is the world's most popular security awareness and simulated phishing platform around. They are located at a home base here in Florida, not too far from where I'm located as well. It's a great organization. We actually, if you recall, and you've been following this podcast, we had a coworker of his on, I believe it was episode number 2, Mr. Roger Grimes. Roger is the one that I absolutely love talking with him because he, if you recall, Andrew, he's the one that has a lot of factual data behind his statements.
Oh, yeah.
And that is what I really appreciate him. Yeah. We can all sit here and have our opinions, but if you back it up with data, it's kind of hard to refute what you're trying to say.
Exactly.
So right after this, we're going to bring Perry on. Well, we're back from the break, and it's time to bring our guest on today. And let's get right to this because I think we're going to have a lot of information to talk about. Perry Carpenter, welcome.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
It's our pleasure, and really thank you for taking the time out to do this podcast with us. We're going to dive right into and talk about your latest book. I guess my first question, though, is why did you decide to write another book after your first one?
Yeah, it's a little bit of taking on a lot of punishment. But one of the things that I had kind of been evangelizing for over 10 years has been this idea of security culture, of the fact that it's important, that it transcends awareness and all the other things that we tend to talk about. And I thought that I had communicated that fairly well in Transformational Security Awareness. There was an entire, pretty thick chapter on culture because I go through, talk about awareness and communication. Then I do a big chapter on behavior science and another one on culture and basically the anthropology of security awareness, but it still didn't really, I think, make the impact that I hoped that it would make. And one of the things that I had seen over the past 3-ish years has been that the phrase security awareness has actually gained a lot of traction. There are a lot of people I should say security culture. The phrase security culture has gained a lot of traction. There were a lot of people writing articles about it, giving keynote speeches about it, talking about the importance of it. But the one thing that they never did is actually define what they meant by that. And I went back in 2019 and ran a survey that we had Forrester Consulting come in and run for us so that it would have all the right rigor and be an objective third party and everything else. And what they found is that about 94% of people say a good security culture is really, really important for a security program to do well. So 94% of people say security culture is important, but then when they asked all the different respondents what that means to them, there was no agreement on what it meant. Mm-hmm. In fact, you could kind of bucket it out into 5 different areas of what they meant by that, and none of them were inclusive enough. Yeah. In fact, the one that was probably the best only had about 12% of the population thinking that that's what it meant. And so people like us would get up and evangelize security culture in front of let's say a group of 1,000 people or so, and 900 plus would be nodding their heads saying it's a great thing, but then we don't realize that we're not speaking the same language. Yeah. And so this was to set an expectation about what security culture actually is so that we can start to talk about how to achieve it.
Right. And that was what I'd run into the last several years too. I can remember bringing up that term security culture almost 10 years ago when I was trying to build security programs. But the problem, as you mentioned, you'd get so many different definitions of what is security culture, and nobody really understood what it was. And if you had it in your own mind and can work it out, you can make things happen, but you still got to sell it. You still got to make that understanding throughout the organization you're working with to understand what a security culture is. But let's get into that a little bit, talking about security culture. Let me hear your definition of what security culture is.
So we define security culture as the ideas, customs, and social behaviors of an organization that influences its security. And so it's those things, ideas, customs, and social behaviors. And I could actually, if we move away from the definition now, the way that I think about it is that at all times, we tend to want to talk about knowledge. That's what security awareness talks about a lot, is knowledge. But once you start thinking about culture, it's so much more than just knowledge acquisition. So to start to express into culture, you have knowledge, and knowledge can get codified into beliefs. So we can start to now believe the thing that we've been taught. Beliefs can then codify into value systems, and value systems can begin to express themselves through behaviors. And behaviors in groups become culture, because it is the behaviors and the values and the beliefs of a group that start to reinforce one another and create this kind of continual cycle about what is the expected beliefs or values or behaviors within that group. And once you're dealing with those kind of unwritten rules, what we would call societal norms, then you've got culture.
Right. Yeah. The one thing I appreciated what you did in this book, which you did in your first one too, but in this one, I think you've really knocked it out of the park. And I think it's an easy read for those that are listening. Pick this book up. I can't stress enough how important this particular book is for those people that are wanting to understand more about what cyber is in your organization, specifically the leaders out there. There are some really good concepts and ideas and recommendations that can easily be done in any organization. But Perry, the one I really appreciated the most that you did in this is bring in the behavior side of all of this, the psychological side, because that's what's important about a security culture. It is a change in ideas and behaviors. In chapter 7 of your book, you went through interviews of different people about what is security culture and what do you think their definition is. And there was one in there I picked out that I really liked his definition, and it's John Childress from Pexis Culture Technologies. And basically, I'm going to read this right out of the book. And your question is there a specific definition of culture that you find useful? And his, to me, just was the sum of what I really liked. And he says, culture is an ecosystem of organizational elements that influence and sustain employee behaviors in a predictable, certain way. the output of all that is behavior.
Yeah.
And I really like that, because that, if you can get people, I think you also mentioned it someplace else in your book too, that people can have all the facts in front of them and still not make a right decision. You know, it really is a behavior. They have to understand why they need to change their behavior. And if security is going to be, if it's going to take off and it's going to be important in an organization, there is a behavior change that has to occur.
Yeah, there's a few things that fit into that. So first, I'll give another bit of props to John Childress. He has one of the favorite quotes that I say all the time, which is, "You get the culture that you ignore." And that culture always wants to go to a middle level of acceptability. And so it's always going to find that lowest common denominator, or that kind of agreed upon group of least intrusive behaviors. And so you're always going to get the culture that you ignore, so if you're not constantly pushing on that, molding it to where you want it to be, it's going to default to something else that you have no impact over.
Yeah.
The other thing, when you talk about behaviors, in both books, I talk about what I call the knowledge intention behavior gap. So you can know something and never intend to act on it, which we do all the time when we pass speed limit signs and everything else. We know policies, we know procedures, we know what's expected of us. We just don't care. And then even when we do care, when there's the intention to act on that, we may not behave. So there's a gap between knowledge and intention, and there's a gap between intention and behavior. And we have to deal with that when it comes to our security program. So out of that flow what I call 3 realities of security awareness. One is, just because I'm aware doesn't mean that I care. Number 2 is, if we try to work against human nature, we will fail. And number 3 is, what an employee does is way more important than what they know.
Right.
So the doing is way more important than the knowing. And to say it as clearly as I can, knowledge alone has never stopped a breach. It's only what somebody does at the point of the breach happening, whether they stop it or allow it to happen. And they can allow a breach knowing all the right things to do to stop it, or they could stop a breach regardless of if they know why they stopped it or not. But there is a behavior piece that comes into that.
Right. And I think that's what's really important. I think I've heard way too many people in cyber that have tried to just bring in awareness training programs and try to change people's behavior just in a training program, and not give them the understanding of why they need to change behaviors or what benefits they would have by changing behaviors. And I realized, real quick in my career, that if I want to get somebody to change their behavior, there's got to be more in it than just the benefit of what is going to happen for the company. I mean,
right.
It's got to be a personal thing here. And one of the things that I like doing in my awareness programs that I help build is I try to make those awareness programs personal. So I've always had the opinion that if you can get a user of a company or anyone with the understanding how critical it is to protect themselves and where the threats and stuff could happen, where they could have problems themselves or their family could have problems, and they learn that, they automatically carry that into the workplace with them. So I always try to get things down to a very personal level.
Yeah, I think that's key. And I mean, if COVID has done anything good for us, it's kind of shown us that there is no workplace and home place divide. Everybody for the past 2 years has had to mix those way more than we ever wanted to from an organizational perspective. But any illusions that we organizational security leaders have had about the fact that there can and should be a perimeter to our security has been totally blown out of the water. That perimeter exists way less now than it ever has. And in fact, for the past 10 to 15 years, we've been talking about the fact that the perimeter's dissolving. It just crumbled over the past 2.
Yeah.
And so what we have now is we have to think about each individual user as their own endpoint. So we can't really put a big perimeter around that user. We need to think about the perimeter being something that's extremely transient, that moves around, and we protect every decision, every behavior, every interaction with another piece of technology through either training at the person level, process and procedure, or policy, or some kind of technology support, or in the best case, a culmination of the 3 of those coming together to provide some kind of guardrails that push people into the desired behavior.
So you just segued into the next topic that I was wanting to bring up, and that's in coming out of your chapter 5 of your book. And that is what's the real goal of all this? Is it awareness, behavior, or culture? You open that kind of with that a lot of people take a myopic view of this, and they try to focus in one area to get a culture into an organization. And by doing so, that's going to fail immediately because there's so much more. Why don't you explain a little bit more about that?
I'll back up for a second and talk about a little bit about, this was again in the first book as well, but I want to kind of grow this idea a little bit. In the first book, I talked about the fact that we need to understand our why for everything, and that the employee really needs to understand why the security awareness program is important for them to engage in. So that goes back to your last question. If we can tie this to something that's already important to them, then they'll care about it more. They'll adopt those behaviors. They'll bring those value systems on, and they'll, do all the things that we're hoping that they're going to do. That's if we attach the why to something that they care about, and we give them viewpoint into that. But then there's another why that we need to think about, which is, why does security awareness exist in the first place? What problem is it trying to solve? And then I think to do that, we also have to ask an even bigger why, which is, why does security exist in the first place? Why do we have a security program, much less a security awareness program? And the reason for that is ultimately to reduce risk in an organization to a tolerable level, so that that organization can go about the business of doing whatever business it was created for. And for me, everything comes back to, that's why just about any part of society exists, or any organization exists, is to serve some bit of the human condition. Bringing toothpaste to people is to serve the human condition. Opening up a retail store is to serve the human condition. You're trying to meet people's real material needs, or something that they feel like they need. And so when it comes to attaching security to those things, yeah, we bring security in so that that store can function, so that we can get toothpaste to people, so that we can deliver services to people. And we want to reduce the security-related risk down to a tolerable level to let that actually happen. Now, when it comes to security awareness, it is that we are trying to manage and reduce the human-related risk within a security program, so that the security program and the organization can ultimately drive down risk to a manageable level to allow that organization to, again, further the human condition in some way. And so once we start to adjust all of our whys in the right direction, then it really informs a lot of the things that we bring out of that. It's not that we're doing tunnel vision on quote unquote awareness, or quote unquote behavior, or quote unquote culture. It is, what part of our program is reducing human risk to a tolerable level within the organization. If we can do that through knowledge, that's great. If we do that through behavior management, that's great. If we do that through shared expected norms and social behaviors, then that's great as well. But all of those come together ultimately to meet that why.
Right. And so what do you think the biggest failure out of all of those would be? If you culminate all of this into one idea, what would you say would cause the biggest failure of not being able to do this?
Ah, man, that's a good question. The biggest failure, I think, comes down to that tunnel vision. It's kind of going the traditional route and saying, oh, we deal with human stuff through quote unquote awareness, and then awareness for some reason means that we put meaningless information in front of people and policy-based information, and then just hope for the best. And so I guess if we're backing up a level from that, then that is a result of a bigger failure. And the bigger failure is the fact that either the security leader or the executive management of the organization doesn't actually understand what they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, which brings me to this point that I think is probably the two most important sentences in your whole book. And I've got them highlighted and I refer to them constantly. Yep. Well, it goes right back to exactly what you were saying here. And that's right at the beginning of your chapter 5. And you wrote, knowledge, social pressures, and the right technologies all have a part to play. An over-focus on any single technology or method is very likely to set you up for failure or leave you with a false sense of security. And that's that myopic view, because too many I've seen focus on one of those areas only, and they get really good at that, but the other two causes them to fail and they don't understand why.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see that expressed in several different ways. So some of it has been the traditional, oh, we're doing awareness, we have policy, attestation, we've got all this stuff, so we're good, right? And then we look at the Verizon DBIR and other things and we see, oh, no, wait, 82% of data breaches still come back to humans. So clearly we're doing something wrong. And you look at people even that say, all right, we're going to take on behaviors and we're going to deal with phishing, and they focus on the phishing program, and they do that in the wrong way. They send out the same template all the time, and they've trained people to understand what that template looks like, but not what a real phish looks like. Or they do phishing assessments once a year, which is, I tell people, if you do phishing assessments once a year, it's like going to the gym once a year. You only realize how pathetic you are. You never actually make gains. And so if you want to make gains in any kind of physical, with the way that the physical world works, the way that sports works, the way that our bodies work, the only way to make gains is to continually practice and continue to engage.
Right.
And so that means that you don't just do once a year, you don't just do once a quarter, you actually do it as frequently as your organization and your people can tolerate it. And then until, I guess in the physical, strength-based training world, you do it until form failure. Same way, I think in the security world, you do your testing, you do your training, all that continuous stuff until there's some kind of issue that might be created within the culture of you can literally do too much of this stuff.
Right.
To the point where the culture and your people won't tolerate it. But there's a happy medium in there where you're getting the gains that you need and you haven't hit that point of diminishing returns or excessive pushback yet.
That basically comes back to how are you measuring what you're doing?
Yeah.
Because I'm with you. I think you can overtrain. You can provide too much information or do something so much that they just get immune to it. What's happened in the last few years when it seemed like every time you turn around, you hear of a data breach on TV.
Right.
At some point, the people got tired of hearing about it, so they no longer cared about it anymore. It's almost like the same thing going on with the Russia-Ukraine war right now. Here in the United States, you're not hearing a whole lot of it on TV anymore because it's just old news. It's still going on, and it hasn't changed today as it did the first week of the war. But people are becoming very insensitive to it.
Yeah, it's still horrific. It's just in the background because there's always something to take our attention away. There's a great book by a guy named Charles Chaffin called Numb, and he talks about that, is that in our world where we constantly have all the news coming at us, all these different prompts from social media, and our smart devices and everything else always hitting us up, essentially we get to the point of lethargy with that. And I think with training, we can do the same thing. We can either make people feel like it's just one more thing and it doesn't matter anymore, or that the problem is so dire that they have to disengage from it. And we have to be really careful as security people to build the relationship in the right way and to build our program and the frequency pieces in the right way so that we get that optimal piece and we don't overdo something or underdo something. The other thing we can do is, again, if you go back to physical training, we've all seen somebody that goes to the gym and they do all their upper body work, but they never pay attention to their legs. And so they get these little twig legs and the rest of their body is developed. I think in security, we can do the same thing. And even in phishing, we can do the same thing. We can teach people not to click links, but if we neglect things like attachments, then we've got a problem. You've trained one arm and not the other.
Exactly.
Or if you train links and attachments, but you fail to acknowledge business email compromise, which doesn't have any of that.
Mm-hmm.
So in all of that, you set yourself up for failure because you've too narrowly defined the thing that you're training on. And I think that's a really big problem that I see over and over and over again with people who haven't thought about this enough. It's kind of like training kids to the test in high school. They learn how to pass that test, but they don't actually learn how to pass life.
Mm-hmm.
We can get all of these numbers to where we want them to be and still set ourselves up for a huge failure day whenever the real phishing email comes through if we're not careful.
Right. So, Andrew, you've been kind of quiet. I'm just wondering how we're doing technically. You got any questions?
Well, technically, you're definitely not going over my head. I was going to bring up a point, but before I bring up the main point I was thinking about, when you talk about numbness, I think, Perry, and correct me if I'm wrong, but your ideas on behavior and culture should kind of override that, because if it's part of your culture, it's
right.
what you do. So, and I think maybe that's what it,
yeah.
Before that happens, yes, people may get numb if it's not part of their culture, but if it becomes part of their culture, then there's nothing to get numb about because it's just what they do.
Exactly. I love the way that you said that. I mean, there's lots of things in our society and in the little pockets of life that we live in where we just behave certain ways or believe certain things or use certain vocabulary words just because that's what everybody around us does. And we can do that in our organization when it comes to security. So you don't have to deal with the numbness because it's just the way things are done around here. You don't even think about why anymore. You just do the thing.
Right. You know, being Army on these podcasts and listening to you cybersecurity experts, I always start thinking, you know, military concepts when I hear you talking. And this one, I think of force protection, or concepts of force protection, and how ingrained, you know, culturally and behaviorally those ideas are in the Army.
Yeah.
You were kind of getting at, you know, how do you get that, you know, in the business world to where those kind of concepts are ingrained? One of the differences that just came to mind is that, you know, from a military point of view, those concepts are ingrained because we train off of a threat. You know, when we're training, or whether we're training or it's, you know, operational, you know, real world operational stuff, we're training off of a threat scenario. So it's not something that is amorphous, you know, and I would just wonder if that's part of the problem, that people don't see a real threat. So, you know, getting that ingrained culturally is just that much more difficult because they don't see an everyday threat.
Right. You know, Andrew brings up a really good point there, Perry. I think sometimes that we also, as we're training our users to do the right thing and showing them, we fail often to tell them why we're doing something. And that is exactly what he's alluding to there. And if we don't get the threat across to our users in an understandable way, then it's just going to go right over their head and they're not really going to see a threat.
Yeah, exactly. That was that first level why that I talked a lot about in the Transformational Security Awareness book, which is tying that why back so that the user understands every bit of information that you're trying to give them, or every guidance that you're trying to give them, why that actually matters, what makes it relevant. But the only way to really do that is to bring the information out of the abstract. And when you're creating the why, tie it into some kind of emotion or story or graphic or something that works with our minds the way that our minds are designed to work, which is very emotional. It kind of pushes the logic to a secondary concern. It's very visceral in some way. I want to be clear, I'm not talking about using fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but you can use stories that make somebody the hero, that make a situation the villain, that talk about the failures of other people, and do that in a way that actually resonates with people without making them overly afraid or guilty or anything else. We do that to our kids all the time. That's what morality tales and fairy tales and fables and all of that are. And we remember the story of Little Red Riding Hood or Goldilocks and the Three Bears, or all those, from the time we first hear them until probably the day that we go to the grave, we remember those stories. And I think we can do similar things in the cyber world.
You're bringing up something that could be a topic for another podcast on another day, and that would be, what are the requirements for someone wanting to get into cyber leadership? It's not just knowing technical stuff. It's understanding people, how to communicate, how to come up with the good ideas and getting people to change behaviors. There's a lot that goes into trying to be a security leader today.
Yeah, and even being able to move that messaging around. So there's a piece of messaging that you use for your end users. There's different messaging and different sets of why that you use for the mid-level management. There's another facet that you bring to your executive level, and then other pieces that are relevant to the board. So it's knowing how to pitch the right bit of information to the right audience at the right time, and tie all of those back to the whys and the core values and the stories that are going to matter the most to them.
So let's go another area here, and that is in the area of laws and regulations. So as you know, Perry, there's also been an underlying problem in the cyber field of trying to be compliant, get a company compliant. And quite frankly, there have been too many security professionals out there that kind of pushed that so much that the companies or a company thought being compliant was more important than a lot of other things. So the question I have for you is, over the years, is how has laws and regulations and compliance to those things changed the idea of security? And has it been positive, or has it really been overall a negative experience?
I'm going to give you, so I was a Gartner analyst before I was at a vendor. And so I'm going to give you the typical analyst response to a question like that, which is, it depends. And it depends on how you look at it. So there are definite downsides that come with regulation. In the same way I talked about people training to the test when it comes to school stuff, because that is the known thing that you need to bypass or hit the level of in order to quote unquote pass. With regulations, we have the same thing. But if you look at history, when we say, hey, leave it to us, we'll regulate ourselves, most of the time we don't. You look at the auto industry, you look at many of the employer types of things that are now regulated through OSHA, you look at all of that, and there was never the economic or the time incentive to regulate ourselves. Because ultimately what would happen is and Bruce Schneier does a really great job of explaining this, probably way better than I could from a security perspective. But one of the examples that he gives is that anytime you're designing a product, if somebody says, hey, there's an inherent safety concern with this, we would like you to do X, the organization that does that is now bringing on additional costs that then has to be pushed onto the consumer. Well, now your product costs 2X what somebody else's does, and economics will mean that more people are going to choose that product. Even if yours is technically better, it's safer, your company may suffer because you've done the better thing. And so the good thing that regulation does is it says everybody has to meet at least these requirements. Think about food safety. And once that becomes the thing, then you're removing all of the economic uncertainty around doing the right thing. And so then the thing becomes, oh, well, can somebody meet the letter of the law without meeting the spirit of the law? And of course, the answer to that is yes. But when we do things like basic food safety, basic mechanical safety for automobiles or for airplanes or anything else, have we actually improved? The answer is probably yes. We have a lot less accidents, a lot less fatalities now than we have in the past around all those different things. And so there is a net improvement, but we stay frustrated because we know we can do better.
Okay, yeah, I like that answer. It's always been on my mind about how companies will do enough just to be compliant. And you're right. If we would leave it up to doing it ourselves, we would never get it done. When you were going through that whole idea, I was thinking, wow, it sounds like if I'm going to sit here and make myself work out and stay in shape, I'm probably not going to get it done. But my spouse being the regulatory authority, yeah, now something is there going to push it and going to make it happen. So yeah, that's kind of, I like, that was the first thing that popped into my mind when you brought that up.
Yeah. I mean, your spouse or in the military context, your employer saying you have to hit these baselines at least once every periodic time of being able to do this many pull-ups, this many push-ups, that you run this amount of this length within this time period. All those things mean that we at least know what our baseline is for good. And a lot of people also complain about things like, and with good reason, they complain against certifications, they complain against all those things, but the purpose for which they were created is genuinely good, is it does set that baseline. The problem is that we then take that baseline and we set it as an expectation of being something way bigger and better than it actually is.
Exactly. And I like your analogy back to certifications, because I'm starting to see that in the industry as well. There's a lot of people out there with the idea that you really don't even need to do certifications anymore. I'm not convinced of that. I think they have their place.
Yeah, I do too. It means that somebody's at least been exposed to and shown for that day that they comprehended the information well enough to pass that certification. Yeah. So I would rather know that somebody comprehended it for a day than that they've never heard of it.
Right. I think the issue is that we probably should be laying off the requirement to have the cert as much as using it as a determining factor whether or not you want to hire the person, not as a set requirement.
Yeah, and I think in hiring specifically, we're seeing the application of a lot more practical things that somebody has to prove at the time of hiring now, which is good. If you're hiring for things that do require a certain skill set, if I can put somebody in a practical lab environment or give them an assessment and they pass at a certain level, that's really good, rather than just saying, oh, this person has a CISSP or this or that certification, so they automatically pass. Because I know a lot of people that don't have the cert that could pass the practical application, and a lot of people that do have the cert that couldn't today.
I'm with you exactly on that one. I've seen that so many times, and I think it's a shame how we place our emphasis sometimes we put too much emphasis in the wrong areas. And I think it just comes down to, again, probably a topic for another podcast, and that's how we hire. To go through one or two interviews and make a determination of whether that person can actually fit, that's a tough thing to do. So all we have is their education background, their certification backgrounds, who they've worked for before, And even then, you're limited in how you can talk to a previous employer.
Right.
That's the sad part about it. And I hate to see a movement of saying, we should stop requiring certifications. I mean, I'm even seeing it here lately, Perry. I don't know if you've noticed or not, talking about whether or not someone should even have a college degree of entering some. And I'm like, boy, I think y'all be very careful about pulling these requirements back and take a look at why you're thinking about pulling those requirements back.
Yeah, I think with all of that, it is there's a core that I think people are getting to, which is if we can assess people at the basis of what that person is actually capable of rather than some of these external things, because I do know people that have kind of gone through certifications and don't remember anything today, or gotten a degree and don't remember anything today. And then somebody else that has gone through and slung themselves through a lot of online training or things that they've done their own, and they really show that they've got the mettle to do something well. I don't want that person, because maybe they couldn't afford to go to a 4-year college or to go to a big SANS course or something like that. I don't want them to have a disadvantage if they can prove that they are actually valuable to the organization. And so that's where I think some of these practical assessments can come in, because we do live in a world where we know that there are some people that have proven that they can do just as well in a non-traditional type of educational setting and upbringing as those of us who have decided to go the traditional route.
Yeah, I'm right with you on that. And we're kind of a little off topic of what we're covering with your security culture, but you're absolutely correct, because I've seen capabilities in really young teenagers that have a greater capacity to do my analyst work than an analyst that I've had for a few years. It's just incredible, the younger generation, how they've taken off with this technology. Yeah,
I mean, it comes down to hunger and curiosity and drive and aptitude. I think if you're looking at all of those, does somebody have the mental aptitude to accomplish something? Do they have the curiosity to stay engaged? Do they have the drive to improve every day? If they've got those things, then they're probably going to do pretty well, regardless of some of these other factors that we tend to look for.
What you just mentioned came out in our last 2 episodes at the top of our list of things that we really wanted to extract in talking with the college kids. And I use it when I'm actually hiring. I'm listening for their passion, their interest, how much are they wanting to get into this field, and what are they wanting to do for this job. And that goes a whole lot more to me than just hearing someone say, I passed my CISSP and I'm ready to go to work next week. If I can hear it in your voice, if I can hear it in your discussions with me that you want to do this, that you're so interested in doing it, you're willing to do anything to get it moving, that's the kind of driver that I'm looking for when at least I'm hiring.
Yeah. If you look at somebody like, I won't single you out, but let's say you look at me or any of us that have done this for a while, I'll broaden it out, and you look at our resume, you'd see a lot of really good stuff on there. Mm-hmm. Does that mean that I would do good as an entry-level analyst? I would probably suck at that job because I wouldn't have the drive to do well. I wouldn't have the same level of curiosity. Right. I wouldn't engage. I think I've already been there and done that, and I'd feel entitled in some way. And so sometimes you look at these and you're like, oh, that person's super, super qualified, but they're not because their heart's not in it. There's a lot of jobs now that my heart wouldn't be in the same way as when I did them the first time. Or even if it's something I never did, maybe my heart still wouldn't be in it for whatever reason. But so you're right. You do have to listen for the passion and understand how that person is going to mold into that job.
Yeah. No, I know Andrew he's just chomping at the bit to get a couple of questions in. So Andrew, it's yours.
Yeah, there's one kind of important one here. At least I think for the audience, because we've been talking about certifications for a little bit now. So I'm going to say what I think you all are talking about. So it sounds to me like you can go through a bachelor's and master's program and get your degree, but until you get certified on particular systems, you can't work in the cybersecurity field. Is that the way this works?
Depends on the role, but yeah, sometimes that does work that way.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wonder what the importance of.
Well, I think there. I'm not sure there's any other field out there that has more certificates that you could possibly get than the cyber field. I mean,
is it just a resume building thing?
Pretty much. That's what it is. There are companies out there that have certification for almost every single little thing you could potentially be doing in IT or security. and there's so many of them. And it was a driving force for a long time, I think, pushed by the certification authorities.
Yeah,
and I think it got to the point where people in our field were putting them on the job description as a requirement to have, and the HR department was seeing those requirements, and if you didn't have it, you weren't going to get in there no matter if you were fully qualified for the job or not. You were not going to get past that particular item on the job requirement, and that's what I think is changing now.
Yeah. And, I think
sounds like another podcast, definitely.
Yeah, probably so. I think that a lot of it is because cyber has been such an evolving field over the past 20 years. So there's lots of new fractured, smaller disciplines that come up. And then somebody is hiring for that the first time, second time, third time. And they're like, what do I actually look for in somebody? And so if there's a certification that then gets developed, then it's kind of that, oh, I know that this person has at least been exposed to this information, may have done jump through these other hoops, and so they're probably going to be a decent candidate. Mm-hmm. And in cyber, there's dozens of those that come along, in the same way that in normal organizational business there could be like a project management professional, there's CPAs, there's all these other ones that come up, but they've had more decades to standardize on the ones that are actually meaningful to those pieces of the organization.
Right. Andrew, did you have another question?
Not right now.
Okay. Well, I would kind of like to get toward the end of this podcast, but way I want to do this is, Perry, I want to talk to me about your podcast, Eighth Layer Insights.
Sure. I am on a between the seasons break right now. Should start publishing. Actually, I've still been publishing. I've just been publishing bonus episodes that have less production, so that I can keep the feed alive and keep people engaged and stay involved in the process. But Eighth Layer Insights is a little bit different than most podcasts in that it is done very documentary style. If you've listened to Radiolab or Freakonomics or Planet Money, it's that kind of style. So usually 3 to 4 guests per episode, all of the interviews cut up and kind of, mixed among each other. Lots of sound cues and sound beds and music and even comedy skits and everything else all through it. So it's really about me as somebody that talks about security awareness, a way of saying, hey, if you wanted to talk about this topic to your organization, here's some ways about how I might do that. And then here's some things that may be interesting for you to learn at the same time.
And I think I know, but I'm going to have you to explain, where did you come up with the eighth layer? What is the eighth layer?
Yeah, that comes from the OSI model for networking.
So there's 7 layers to the OSI model, Andrew.
Yep, starting at data and ending at application. And at the other side of any application, whether that's on a laptop or desktop or a phone, there is a person. And so the 8th layer is the human side of things, the piece that's often neglected.
All right. Is there any other thing you'd like, any final comments you'd like to make?
If you do like the work that I do with this intersection of technology and humanity, you may just reach out to me on LinkedIn, go ahead and connect there. I did just start a company as a side business, so I still work for KnowBe4, but to kind of wrap all the writing and everything else I do, I started an organization called 8th Layer Media. That is the organization that I'm running 8th Layer Insights through. And I've also got a couple interesting new podcasts that are going to be coming out of that are a little bit broader than just security as well.
Perfect. Andrew, is there anything you want to bring up before we break we can get ready for our 3-point segment?
Perry, thanks so much for being on here. Great talk. Very informative. Appreciate it. And
thank you. It's been
continued luck with your podcast.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Perry. I do appreciate it. And we'll be back. So we're back with our discussion from Perry Carpenter. He's been a great guest, Andrew, and we've learned a lot. Perry is the author of the Security Culture Playbook. For those of you that are building a security program or attempting to build one or wanting to build one or getting ready to start to build one, I would highly recommend you go pick this book up, because culture is one of the biggest things that has to change in an organization to actually have a successful security program. Again, that's the Security Culture Playbook by Perry Carpenter, and you can pick it up on Amazon. I've been through his book a couple of times and have a lot of notes made, and I just absolutely love the way it was written. So we had that discussion with Perry. If you haven't heard the whole episode, go back and listen to what Perry has to say. Andrew, do you have something you'd like to bring up real quick?
I was just going to say, who knew how enjoyable talking to IT folks could be?
Yeah, I know. Really, you caught me off guard on that one. I don't know what to say about that one. We are sometimes known as a bunch of nerds, and usually nerds only talk to nerds, right?
Yeah, we should probably get into it, though.
Yeah, we do. We need to carry on with this segment. So this segment of our podcast usually goes into the 3 points that we would like for you as a user to take out of this. If you don't take anything else from the podcast, these are the 3 points that we're hoping that you can pick up and use and run with. Let's get it started. Andrew, you want to start off with point number 1?
For point number 1, I've got that just because people are aware doesn't mean that they care.
Yeah, and that's referring to the training that you may give your users. Part of a security program, there's always a security awareness training aspect to that, and that is actually trying to teach the user and making them aware of what the threats might be to the organization, to themselves, what may be wrong with the computer, how to report it, stuff like that. And the point is, and Perry made it very clear, that just because you've actually trained your users and they're now aware of some things, it does not mean they actually care for what they're trying to do. They may not care about cyber. It may still be something that's just getting in their way to doing their workflows and other things. So just because they're aware does not mean they care. Andrew, that pretty much sums it up?
I think so.
Okay, well, let's go straight to number 2.
Number 2, people need to understand the why of cybersecurity.
And that's a big one, something that I've run into through my career when I'm developing programs and developing security awareness training specifically. One of the biggest things you have to do to get user buy-in is that they are understanding why of what you're attempting to do. So if you have a problem in an organization that is bad practice, for instance, it's typical to find an organization that hasn't quite done what they need to do as far as best practice in, let's say, email systems. If you're still allowing third-party emails to be accessed on your corporate network, there are areas there it's going to cause you problems. And just simply shutting something off like that in a network, in a company, may cause you more headaches to right off the bat because people are not going to understand why you just did that. So that's the part we're talking about. You really need to answer that why you do things and why you put controls in places for the user. Let's go to number 3.
For number 3, I've got you can't over-focus in one area.
This particular point is more for your building of the program itself. And that means that because cyber is so wide, you can't focus in one area of cyber protections. You can't just focus solely on email. You can't merely focus on antivirus. It's wide-ranging, and there's a lot to do to create a good security program. So the third point is don't over-focus in one area. You need to be touching every aspect that is the largest threats in your organization, and those areas need to be focused on individually and as a complete program. I think that might cover it, Andrew. Does that sound about right?
Sounds right to me.
Okay, well, good. Well, that was an easy 3-point segment. Again, I want to say thank you to Perry for coming on and having that discussion with us. It was truly enlightening. And again, I highly recommend you go check out his book, The Security Culture Playbook. Andrew, any final thoughts?
No, very enjoyable talking to Perry, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
That's all for now. Thanks again for listening. Thank you for listening to 3 Point Cyber, a production from Alpha Omega Advisors. If you have questions about this episode or have a topic for discussion or a guest you would like us to have on, please email us at 3pointcyber@gmail.com. That's 3, the number 3, point, P-O-I-N-T, cyber, C-Y-B-E-R, all one word, 3pointcyber@gmail.com. We encourage you to share this podcast with others. This podcast is owned and produced by Alpha Omega Advisors. The theme song was created by music producer Andrew Van Wert in Nashville, Tennessee. This is Dave Summit, and until next time, keep on learning.